Hey everybody, and welcome to this discussion of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. This section will be all about Staves 1 and 2. We're going to try to combine those as best we can and talk about what goes on in the story, the plot, and also any extra details that are important to understanding the story. First of all, Charles Dickens wrote this story in 1843. He actually published it himself and wanted to make it a very nice copy. Didn't want it just to put out for the masses. He actually wanted it as a book that would that everyone would be able to read, have access to, even those of the poor who could actually read. He wanted to make sure they had access to this book. And it became an overnight success. He sold a great deal of them, and it again cemented his role as a great British writer and made him so much more popular in England at that time. It's also credited with bringing back many of the traditions that we have nowadays. Before that, many of the traditions and Christmas traditions in England had kind of fallen on the wayside. They weren't doing much anymore. And because of the story, it ignited a lot of the passion for having a Christmas tree and having your home decorated and giving gifts and having dinners and things like that. So we can thank Charles Dickens for reinventing sort of the Christmas celebrations that many of us enjoy even here in the United States. But going on with the Christmas Carol, in the first stave we have Ebenezer Scrooge, obviously, who is a miserly old man. He is a misanthrope, which means he hates everybody. But before we even get introduced to Scrooge, we have Marley's ghost. We have the mention of Marley's ghost. In fact, the whole story begins with, Dickens tells us that Marley was dead to begin with, and there was no doubt whatever about that. He made sure, he says, this must be distinctly understood, or else nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm about to relate, which is basically, if we don't know that Marley's dead at the beginning of the story, then nothing wonderful can happen. And so it's important to know it because Marley, of course, shows up, and he's supposed to be dead. And Scrooge, knew he was dead. He didn't care. The day of the funeral, he probably went back and actually tried to make a deal or a bargain to make more money. And that's how Ebenezer Scrooge is. We have Scrooge. The plot opens with Scrooge in his counting house, and he's got a clerk named Bob Cratchit who works for him. And Bob works in this little bitty, what's called the tank, sort of off to the side, and he is trying to keep warm because Scrooge won't allow him to burn any extra coal because coal is costly. It costs money, and he doesn't want to spend any money because he's so cheap. Parsimonious would be a better word for him. That's a real fancy word for being extra, extra cheap. But that's the way Scrooge is. And about that time, Scrooge's nephew, Fred, comes in and wishes him a Merry Christmas. And, of course, Scrooge's response to the famous bah humbug, humbug meaning things that are useless or worthless or trivial. And they have this conversation where Fred extols the virtues of Christmas, and how it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in his pocket, but that he believes it's done him good. And Scrooge says that that it's a waste of time. It's just a time for paying bills with no money and finding yourself another year older, another hour richer, and so forth, so on. And finally, Fred invites him to dinner. Scrooge basically says that he'd see himself in blazes first, or basically in hell before he goes to dinner, which is pretty harsh when you think about it. But Fred basically is dismissed, and Fred, of course, this is Scrooge's only living relative, and he treats him very, very poorly, and it's too bad. So we get a good idea of what Scrooge is doing, and we get a good idea of how just really mean and nasty he really is. About that time, after Fred leaves, we have two gentlemen who come in seeking money for the poor, for charity. Scrooge immediately knows why they're there and wants nothing to do with them. And some of the famous lines in there is he asks, talking about the poor, they can't he asks, we're trying to raise money to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. And of course, Scrooge's response is, "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? Is the treadmill still working? Why aren't they there? Oh, well, my taxes pay for all that. That's where they should go." Well, these places were awful. The poorhouse would separate families while they got work for the man, the father. It was a terrible place. It was beneath human dignity in many cases. And they wouldn't go there. In fact, one of the charity men says, "Well, many can't go there and many would rather die." And Scrooge's response is, "Well, if they'd rather die, then let them do it and decrease the surplus population." He says, "That's what they need to do." "Well, just let them die and we'll get rid of them. Won't have that problem anymore." Scrooge believes that the poor are the way they are because they're lazy. Now, in some cases, there are poor people who are lazy, and it's by their own doing. But the majority of poor people aren't, necessarily lazy. But that's the way Scrooge sees it, and so that's how he views it. And of course, the men are stunned by what he says about them dying, and they leave. And he actually sends them off. He tells them they're none of my business or none of my concern. It's important for a man to understand his own business and not interfere with other people's. And he says, "Mine occupies me constantly," and that's the way it is. It's all about Scrooge. So Scrooge actually feels he was quite facetious afterwards, meaning he kind of had a good time telling those guys off. And he sends Bob home. Of course, before Bob goes home, he says, that you'll be expecting the whole day tomorrow, right? He says, "Well, yes, sir." And he's like, well, he was upset with Cratchit because he doesn't feel like he should have to pay for a whole day's wages for no work. And Cratchit says, "Well, it's only once a year." And he says, "Well, that's a poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December." And then he goes home, and Bob goes home, and he's excited to get home to have the whole day with his family. Scrooge doesn't go home to a family; he goes home to a big a big house. It's very dark, and as he approaches, he's searching for his keys. And as he goes to put his keys in the door, he looks up and sees that the knocker on the door has changed, and it's actually the face of his old partner, Jacob Marley, that we mentioned earlier. And it startles Scrooge. The knocker didn't scream or try to scare him. It just looked at him the way that Marley used to look at him, with his glasses pushed up on his forehead and just kind of looking at him. And it was creepy, and the hair was kind of moving, which is even more eerie. And as he looks again, it's gone. Well, it affected Scrooge. He goes in, even checks behind the door to see if anything's there. The house is dark. It's because Scrooge is cheap and he won't buy any more candles. And so it says that darkness was cheap and Scrooge liked it. And then he goes up, but he went into his room. Some of the rooms downstairs were actually let out as businesses. They would do businesses in there. That's how he made more money. And he actually he went into his room and he locked the door. He actually triple locked himself in, which was not his custom. He didn't do that all the time. And of course, then after that, he starts to take his dinner. And when he does that, there's some bells in the house. They start to ring. The bells that tell you that somebody in another room needs you, or the servants are needed in this room, and they start ringing really wildly. And then they stop, and he hears this heavy chain being dragged down in the cellar in the basement. And that's where you start to hear this ghost coming up the stairs. Well, it's Marley's spirit who comes in, and they have a conversation. And Marley tells him why he's there. So, like in this scene right here, Marley comes in and sits down, and they have a conversation where he warns him about the fate that's coming to him, and if he doesn't change his ways, this is what's going to happen to him. He's to be chained up. The chains symbolize they're covered with ledgers and deeds and cash boxes and mortgages and all these things of Marley's business, and that's why he spent all his time in business. He never actually went out and tried to help people. He says that mankind was my business. That's what I should have been about. Charity and goodness and forbearance, all these things, he should have been part of his business, and he didn't do anything about it, and now he's punished to wander the earth like this. The chains come to symbolize his sins and his misdeeds in life. And he tells Scrooge, to sort of be quick about this, tells Scrooge that he'll be visited by 3 spirits, and they'll come the first at 1 o'clock in the morning when the bell tolls 1. And then as he leaves, he motions to Scrooge to come closer, and he sees that as the window opens, that he looks out and there's spirits all over the place. And he saw that the misery of all the phantoms was that they sought to interfere for good in human matters and had lost the power forever, which means they wanted to help people, but now they lost it. They should have done that while they were in the flesh, and that's why they're suffering so much. Well, Scrooge, Marley disappears, and Scrooge is left to himself. And he's not quite sure if he believed it, what happened. Well, he's woken by he's woken at midnight, and he's kind of concerned about that because he says, no, it was after 12 when I went to bed. But the clock, he sits up and he pulls all the bed curtains closed because that's how they kept one way to keep warm in those days because it was very cold. And at 1 o'clock, the chime goes up. Well, all of a sudden, right next to his head, this hand pulls back the curtain, which would creep anybody out, right? And he looks at this spirit, and there's light that it comes from the top of his head. It looks old and young at the same time. It's wearing it has very long white hair, but there's not a wrinkle on its face. He's decked in summer flowers. He's holding a cap, like a cone-shaped thing, the extinguisher to put out a candle. And again, there's a jet of light coming from the top of its head. And, of course, he asks who he is. He says, I'm the ghost of Christmas past. And he says, long past. He says, no, your past. And he begins to show him things from his past. Of course, Scrooge is a little freaked out by this, but the spirit is a very kind and gentle spirit and takes him out on the town, so to speak, and takes him in his childhood. And you start to actually, through this point, start to kind of feel sorry for Scrooge a little bit. He's not a very good person. He's terrible, but you kind of feel a little bit of sympathy for him. He takes him to his old school when he was a little child, and you find out that Scrooge every Christmas was left there by himself. While all the other boys were going home, he was never sent for, never taken home. And we're not told why, but that could be tough on any kid to not go home for the holidays. The scene, again, in that same scene, then you meet his sister Fan, who loves him very much. She loves him, and she's taking him home. He needs to be a man and not go back to school. He's actually begin his career. And it's tough because it's interesting that he loves his little sister Fan very much, but it's ironic that he treats her only offspring, Fred, his nephew, like dirt. And so, there's a little bit of irony there. Now, after that, he takes him to where he was apprenticed, to Mr. Fezziwig's place. There's a big party going on. Everybody's enjoying themselves, and he gets caught up in the party. And he sees himself, and he sees all the people that he associated with. And he saw Fezziwig, his old boss, and he talks about how the spirit says, well, what's the big deal? How did he make you guys all happy? All he did was spend a few pounds of your mortal money. And he says, well, that's not that. He says he had the power to make us sad or happy, to make our work tiresome, or Scrooge realized that this is how he treats his employee, Bob Cratchit. So he then takes him to I can think for a second here, takes him to a very painful point where he sees his fiancée Belle. And Belle is basically breaking up with him. They've been engaged for a very long time. He has come to love money and gold more than her, and has put her before him, put money before her. And she releases him, and he doesn't protest any of that. It's a really sad part, and Scrooge is very upset with the spirit for showing him this. It's very painful, and it even gets more painful when the spirit shows him what happened to Belle, and how she married another man and has all these children, and they're having a Christmas party, and they're so excited, and this, Scrooge gets so angry and screams at the ghost to haunt me no longer, and takes him and puts the bonnet on top of his head and pushes all the way to the floor to turn the light out. And so that's Staves 1 and 2 in a nutshell there pretty quickly. And so after this one, take a look at Stave 3, which is the second of the three spirits, the Ghost of Christmas Present.